For over 3 centuries, the Carthaginian Empire stood as a colossus, casting its shadow over the western Mediterranean. Having come into this world as just one of many Phoenician colonies, Carthage rose to power through her immense wealth and naval prowess. Yet in 238 BC, after decades of unceasing war, with first the emerging Roman Republic and then a savage internal uprising, the foundations that Carthage had built her empire on were violently ripped out from under her. Her naval dominance had vanished, her wealth was spent, and her most vital overseas possessions were extorted in exchange for mercy. The Romans, not satisfied with just crippling Carthage, imposed a yearly war indemnity of 25,000 pounds of silver to be paid over the next 10 years. If Carthage had acted like any of the other Mediterranean states Rome would eventually face, she would have limped along, unable to recover, until the Roman juggernaut decided to stop playing with its food and swallowed her whole. Carthage, however, was to show a resilience that probably shocked even her own citizens, because within just 20 years, Carthage's power burned brighter than it had ever before, and her armies would be wiping out an entire generation of young Roman men in Roman Italy itself. This massive turn in fortune begs the question, how did the Carthaginians manage such a feat? To answer that question, we will look at Carthage's external and internal situation in 238 BC, and the strategy implemented by some of Carthage's greatest citizens to ever draw breath. The geopolitical situation that Carthage found herself in was nothing short of terrifying. The loss of 3 strategically vital and wealthy provinces to Rome was a crushing blow, with Sicily by far being the most devastating. The economic ramifications of losing Sicily were significant, but the strategic implications were nothing short of catastrophic. This was because large naval ships at the time were highly vulnerable to rough seas, which forced navies to hug the coast and seek shelter each night. This meant Sicily acted as a bridge between Rome and Carthage, and whoever controlled it could use it as a shield for their homeland, as well as a spear aimed at their opponent's heart. Rome had also seized the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, which, while not as crucial as Sicily, could still serve as effective bases to launch smaller ships and raid Italy. Later we will delve into how Rome essentially stole Sardinia and Corsica, but with the loss of these islands, Carthage had also lost the ability to strike out at Rome altogether. This made Carthage the geopolitical equivalent of a wounded animal, unable to retaliate against its attacker. The worst part about Carthage's weakened state in 238 BC was that it wasn't caused by the Romans, but was instead caused by a series of self-inflicted wounds at the hands of Carthage's incompetent political leaders. In 248 BC, while Carthage was in the middle of fighting Rome, Carthage's senate became dominated by a small clique of land-owning aristocrats. These men relied on large slave-run estates in North Africa for their wealth and gained very little from overseas trade. Since they personally wouldn't profit from Carthage's conflict with Rome, they wanted to end the war and pursue an expansionist policy in North Africa to grow their estates and subdue the nomadic raiders in Numidia. In pursuit of this policy, they abandoned Carthage's mercenary army still fighting Rome in Sicily, disbanded a large portion of her war fleet, and diverted large amounts of men and money to conquering more land in North Africa. However, completely unexpectedly, the army abandoned in Sicily halted Rome's expansion. Their young general, Hamilcar Barca, proved to be a military mastermind and was undefeated in the field. So even after Carthage's nobility neglected the war with Rome, it would still grind on for another 7 years, only ending after Carthage's self-weakened fleet was smashed in 241 BC. After this defeat, Carthaginian leadership instructed Hamilcar to negotiate a peace with Rome. Hamilcar refused to surrender to a foe who had not beaten him in the field, and forced the aristocrats to push this responsibility onto one of the governors in the area. The resulting Treaty of Lucanius ceded Sicily to Rome and imposed a war indemnity on Carthage of 180,000 pounds of silver to be paid over the next 10 years. But almost immediately after leading Carthage to this humiliating defeat, The aristocratic faction mishandled the mercenary army returning from Sicily so badly that they revolted and co-opted many of Carthage's Libyan subjects to join them. These rebels crushed the aristocratic-led armies and threatened to siege the city of Carthage itself. With this threat, the aristocrats were forced to recall Hamilcar Barca to lead Carthage's armies once again. Hamilcar, through adroit diplomacy with the Numidians and brilliant tactics, was able to lead Carthage through one of recorded history's most barbaric conflicts before finally overwhelming the rebels in North Africa. This conflict marked the end of aristocratic rule in Carthage. Their incompetence at every turn had cost Carthage a war and almost led to her complete annihilation. The former minority faction that represented the populace and the merchant class took over, with Hamilcar Barca and his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair as its leaders. This change in government likely startled the Romans because, unlike the party of aristocrats, this party was staunchly opposed to Rome, which might have influenced what happened next. One of the first acts by this newly formed government was to retake the islands of Sardinia and Corsica from the rebellious mercenary garrisons. These islands had been a part of Carthage's territory for hundreds of years and were an extremely important source of timber, agricultural goods, and metal. Hearing of this expedition, the Roman Senate made the outrageous claim that this was an act of war against Rome and threatened war unless Carthage revoked her claims to the island and paid an additional 70,000 pounds of silver to Rome over the next 10 years. Even though Sardinia was outlined in the Treaty of Lutanius as Carthage's sphere of influence, the Roman Senate knew Carthage was too weak to not fold to their demands. But the worst was yet to come, because the very next year, Rome launched its own expedition and took Sardinia. This blatant act of strong-arm robbery by the Romans angered and humiliated the Carthaginian people, and it was at this point that Hamilcar likely realized what Rome truly was. A monstrous beast that would stop at nothing until it consumed everything in its path, including Carthage. Hamilcar, understanding the harsh reality of Carthage's weakened state, knew that to protect Carthage he had to take bold action, and so he set his sights on building a new empire for Carthage. As he surveyed the vast Mediterranean, he quickly realized that his options were limited. The powerful Hellenistic kingdoms dominated to the east, while to the north loomed the mighty Roman Republic, and anything worth having in North Africa was already under Carthaginian control. This left only one option: the wild and rugged Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is a rugged landmass jutting out of the southwest corner of Europe. The peninsula's mountains and high plateaus has bred a people as hard and ruthless as the land itself. The many tribal groups of this region are almost in a perpetual state of war with one another, producing extremely skilled and ferocious warriors. The combination of skilled fighters and unforgiving terrain makes this land a nightmare for any power to conquer and to pacify. To avoid getting tied down, Carthage's foreign policy in this region has always been to facilitate trade with the locals and not to attempt to conquer them. But Hamilcar is about to drastically upend this long-held policy and attempt to put this area under direct Carthaginian control. If he is able to overcome the challenges, the rewards will be great. Carthage will gain access to massive pools of manpower, productive agricultural lands, and large quantities of war loot. But the largest prize of all are the Iberian silver mines. The output of these mines are so vast that contemporary Greek historians spoke of the rivers running with molten silver during forest fires. An obvious exaggeration, but still speaks volumes to the amount of wealth locked in the Iberian ground. With the invasion of Iberia in the front of his mind, Hamilcar built an army, but before he unleashed them on Iberia, he had to neutralize any potential opposition from his political rivals. To this end, in a brilliant move, he launched an attack on the Numidians. This move pleased the Africa First aristocratic party and gave his troops valuable experience, and had the bonus of providing him with more access to the most skilled horsemen in the western Mediterranean, the Numidian cavalry. But in 237 BC, After a year of campaigning in Numidia, Hamilcar took his army of roughly 20,000 Liberian heavy infantry and Numidian cavalry across the North African coast and crossed the Straits of Hercules to set up a base of operation in the Punic city of Cadiz. Hamilcar's first priority in Iberia was to secure the Guadalquivir River basin, an area of gentle rolling hills surrounded by steep mountains. This was a fertile land surrounded by silver mines, with a navigable river to transport these goods to the sea. The local tribes weren't unified, and the fear of having to fight Hamilcar's army was enough for the tribes to one by one submit to Carthaginian rule without a fight. It wasn't until Hamilcar pushed his forces deep inland that he faced fiercer resistance, eventually coming into contact with a coalition army composed of two large tribes. Hamilcar's army was outnumbered 2.5 to 1, and if he lost this battle, it was likely his goal of pulling Carthage from a weakened state would die here with him. During the battle, the barbarian tribes showed their trademark fierceness, but the discipline of the Carthaginian soldiers and Hamilcar's military brilliance was overwhelming. This victory cemented control of southern Iberia and its rich silver mines. After the battle, Hamilcar employed a simple yet effective strategy. He killed the tribal leadership and gave their former followers the option to go home or join his army, a move designed to eliminate competing centers of power and build up his own forces. Though the Guadalquivir River basin and its surrounding mountains were a rich prize, they alone could not rebuild Carthage's strength. With this in mind, Hamilcar turned his attention to the silver mines in the Baetic Mountains to the east. But this would prove to be a much more arduous task than his original conquest. The topography of this region is some of the most rugged in a peninsula renowned for its ruggedness, with slivers of hilly land wedged between steep mountain slopes in the Mediterranean Sea, the perfect landscape for guerrilla warfare. The people of this area are known as the Iberians, to whom the peninsula was named after. They are top-tier warriors skilled in mountain warfare and hit-and-run tactics. The Iberians are not only skilled fighters, but are also a semi-urbanized and organized culture. This means each tribe can put up a more organized defense against Carthage by using guerrilla tactics in conjunction with fortified settlements. Luckily for Hamilcar, though these tribes are organized, they are not united. He can take on the tribes one at a time and play them off each other if necessary. The details of this expansion are scarce, but we know that even with this advantage, it still took Hamilcar 8 years of constant fighting to extend Carthaginian influence to Cape No. This conquest was undoubtedly a quagmire, full of broken alliances, sieges, and cautious movements through the same territories year after year to re-establish control. Hamilcar's strategy of killing the defeated tribe's leaders and allowing their soldiers to return home or join his army, as well as establishing fortified settlements, slowly but surely begin to grind down Iberian resistance. By 238 BC, Carthage's conquest of this area was almost assured. But catastrophe struck. While besieging an enemy settlement, Hamilcar was unable to keep his army supplied and sent a large portion of his army back to friendly territory. He was then confronted by a force of the neighboring tribe, the Ortini, who offered to help with the siege. But their chief had other plans, only pretending to be friendly before attacking Hamilcar's smaller force. This betrayal sparked a chaotic battle, with Hamilcar's army ultimately being defeated and pursued back to their base. Hamilcar split his remaining forces, sending one portion with his son and taking the other portion with him, and as he led his column across a river, Hamilcar drowned, leaving Carthage's people in shock and mourning. The architect of Carthage's resurgence was dead. In just 9 years, he had conquered tens of thousands of square miles and brought Carthage back from the brink of financial ruin and military obsolescence. Upon hearing this news, it is likely that both Roman and Iberian statesmen let out a sigh of relief. Carthage's reputation for competent leadership was not high at this point, but unfortunately for those statesmen, Hamilcar's second-in-command and son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair would shatter their hopes. Hasdrubal's first order of business was to avenge Hamilcar's death. He knew that the death of his father-in-law could not go unpunished, and any show of weakness would only invite further aggression from the tribes both inside and outside of Carthaginian control. Hasdrubal took bold and decisive action, seizing control of the Ortines tribe's walled cities and torturing their leaders to death. It was a ruthless move, but it was a necessary one to secure Carthage's position. Even after this victory, Carthage still likely mourned the loss of Hamilcar and his military brilliance. But Hasdrubal was able to compensate for his absence with his own unique set of skills. While he might have not been a military genius, Hasdrubal was an incredibly competent governor and diplomat. His ability to manage the wealth and army he inherited was nothing short of remarkable. One of his first acts after tearing down the Ortini was to build the city of New Carthage, which quickly became a thriving hub of commerce and trade, as well as a gilded cage for the hostage sons and daughters of Iberian nobles, a shrewd move to ensure loyalty. With his headquarters established, for the next 3 years Hasdrubal extended Carthage's holdings up the east coast of Iberia, by diplomacy if possible, and if not possible by unleashing the tens of thousands of soldiers at his disposal. As Carthage power continued to expand up the east coast of Iberia, Rome began to receive increasingly alarmed reports from their Greek allies in southern Gaul. The idea of Carthage gaining more power and influence was deeply troubling to Rome, as they were under threat of invasion from their Gallic neighbors to the north as well. The prospect of having to engage two powerful rivals at once was terrifying to Rome, and it knew it had to tread carefully. This meant that for the first time in decades, Rome found itself in the position of weakness when compared to Carthage. They couldn't threaten war with Carthage because Carthage was strong enough to call their bluff. So instead, Rome was forced to come to the negotiating table as an equal. This was the kind of delicate diplomatic situation that Hasdrubal thrived in. He was able to deftly negotiate a deal with Rome that set the Ebro River as the clear boundary for Carthage's sphere of influence, effectively opening up the entire Iberian Peninsula to Carthaginian conquest without fear of Roman interference. This was a major concession by Rome, and it speaks volumes to the respect and fear Rome had for both Carthage and Hasdrubal. Armed with this treaty, Hasdrubal continued his relentless campaign up to the Ebro River. But in 221 BC, tragedy struck once again when Hasdrubal was assassinated, leaving Carthage reeling from the loss of her leading citizen. Hasdrubal had not only been an effective steward of Hamilcar's vision, but he had built upon it. At the time of his death, he had 100,000 battle-hardened and well-equipped soldiers at his command, and thanks to the silver mines, was likely the wealthiest person in the entire Mediterranean. Within just 20 years, his and Hasdrubal's leadership had transformed Carthage from a weak and vulnerable state to once again having a colossal empire whose shadow loomed over the Mediterranean, and in many ways more imposing than it had ever before. It was up to the next generation of Carthaginian leadership to maintain and hopefully grow Carthage's power. And fortunately for them, this mantle of responsibility fell onto the shoulders of one of history's greatest military commanders, Hamilcar's son, Hannibal Barca.